Hello everyone and good evening. Welcome to National Forensic Sciences University webinar series. And for today's talk, we have a special guest, Dr. William R. Belcher. He's PhD, DABFA, and he's an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He's a board certified forensic anthropologist, and prior to coming to UNL, he served as the deputy director of the US Department of Defense's Defense Prisoner of War and Missing in Action Accounting Agency Central Identification Laboratory, which is responsible for the investigation, recovery, identification of over 83,000 missing US service members from all conflicts from World War II and later. So without wasting any more time, I would request me, Dr. William, to put some light on the roles and responsibilities of forensic archaeologists. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Can you see my screen? I think that this should be okay. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, sir. We can see your screen.
Great. Thank you. I just wanted to say this is a great opportunity for me, and I want to thank all the organizers. And when we went out to Gandhinagar in this last January, you were the Gujarat Forensic Science University, and now you are the National Forensic Science University. And I wanted to say congratulations, because that is a great honor and a great role for the university and India. And so I'm very happy to be part of this series. And so thank you for the invitation. So I just wanted to get into just discussing the roles and responsibility of the forensic archaeologist. And so we'll talk a little bit about forensic anthropology, archaeology, anthropology, and some of the tools and tricks that we use as forensic archaeologists. So first of all, because I know that this isn't part of the curriculum at the National Forensic Science University, but I know that a lot of you have some background in this about what is anthropology to begin with. So at least in the United States, anthropology is the study of humanity and in all of its aspects. And so what we really want to do is to look at humanity in terms of these four fields of archaeology, physical or biological anthropology, which is part of, or which is forensic anthropology is part of that, cultural or social anthropology, and linguistics. And so I don't really, even though I'm a board certified forensic anthropologist, I consider myself part of anthropology in general, because I have done a lot of these activities in my career. But what are some of these specifics about this? So we have archaeology. So the university is just north of Lothal, which is a really important archaeological site for India, with the Sarasvati or Harappan or Indus Valley civilization. So it's, some of you may be already familiar if you've gone to that important site about what archaeology is. So it's the interpretation of humanity's past from surviving material culture, looking at things that are in the ground to understand how people lived in the past. And physical anthropology is the study of the structure, the physiology, and the evolution of the human organism, as well as study of its fossil ancestral forms. Cultural or social anthropology is the study of the social and cultural systems developed by humans during their daily interactions. I think that's something that obviously we're all very familiar with, but it also has a very scientific aspect study as an anthropologist. And then linguistics is the study of the language. There's both vocal and non-vocal are sort of behaviors that we exhibit when we're communicating that are non-vocal and used by humans or higher. I think somebody, if their mic is on, because I'm getting feedback, and so I'm actually hearing my own voice come back over. So
I request everybody else to please turn off their mic and camera as well, please. That would be really helpful.
Okay, thank you
so much.
So I just wanted to, like I said, in my career, I've done a lot of this. And so, what is anthropology? The excavations that I was involved at in Harappa in Pakistan, we had done a lot of the excavations of the cemetery, what we call the Harappan cemetery, or used to be called Cemetery R37. And so we did the excavations as well as the physical anthropology of these remains. And then excavation, I've done a lot of excavation in South Asia, as well as throughout my other career with the Department of Defense all over the world. Excavating here on a site that was eventually a domestic compound in the mound of Harappa. Additionally, I also studied the culture of fishing folk on the southern coast of Pakistan. So I spent 13 months living in a fishing village, working and recording the fishing culture of this small village. And then finally with linguistics, with the, I'm not really a formal linguist and I don't really do that, but I did have to learn a few languages to interact with the people that I was working with in Pakistan and India. So again, I consider myself a holistic sort of anthropologist, even though this part of my career is focusing on excavation of human remains and identification remains as a board certified forensic anthropologist. So first of all, you know, we can talk about forensic archaeology in a moment, but it is part of forensic anthropology. So what is it? So forensic anthropology is the use of the methods of physical anthropology and archaeology applied to a medical legal setting. And so those of you at the National Forensic Science University are well aware of what the medical legal situation is. So everything that we are doing or everything that you're learning in forensic odontology, question documents, ballistics, it's all related back to understanding the analysis of evidence in a medical legal setting. So how can we understand what happened in this medical aspect, particularly dealing with forensic odontology at the National Forensic Science University, or dealing with the analysis of actual evidence. So, but in this lecture, I'm going to be concentrating on the use of archaeology to understand and interpret different kinds of scenes of crime and mass disasters. And so just think of this as a scientific, fully trained aspect of collecting and processing evidence, but in a very specific manner of using archaeology to reconstruct the past or reconstruct what happened at a crime scene and how it has been modified since the crime occurred. So we can talk about that. So forensic anthropology and archaeology is this applied subdiscipline of physical anthropology, but we have 5 main objectives. And I'm not going to go through all of these because I actually gave another lecture last month at the Sherlock Forensic Science Institute concerning the biological profile, how we do that. But I'll talk a little bit about this. But we have 5 main objectives. So establish the biological profile that we can compare to personnel records or medical records or interviews of a person, perimortem trauma, what happened at the time of death, post-mortem interval, how long has this person been dead? And that's one of the first questions I usually get asked when we're doing excavations by my police and constabulary colleagues. They want to know, how long has this person been dead? And so this is a really important part of forensic archaeology and forensic anthropology research. What is the forensic context? Is this material, is it archaeological or is it a forensic interest? Is it a medical legal interest or is it ancient material that really doesn't pertain to a medical legal investigation? And then finally, we want to get into personal identification of those individuals. So what is the biological profile? And so that is looking at concepts of how old is this person? What's their sex or gender? What's their geographic origin or ancestry, and how tall were they? And so these are the basic concepts that we can look at to determine who is this individual? So we can begin to look at how old they are, what's their gender or sex, where did they come from, and how tall were they? And so these are the kinds of things that we can use to begin to identify an individual. The other thing that forensic anthropologists are going to do is to look at aspects of trauma analysis. Legally, forensic anthropologists, at least in the United States, cannot offer or render an opinion of death, or the manner or mode of death of these individuals, but we can provide evidence that allows a medical professional to make this determination. And so we can talk about different kinds of trauma analysis on the bones. Was it sharp force trauma? Was it blunt force trauma? Was it ballistic trauma? So we can do the physical analysis of the material, but at least in the United States, legally, we cannot render an opinion of death. And then finally, we want to do personal identification. What aspects of the skeleton, and primarily we would do this through, we could do it through DNA, different forms of DNA, but we can also do it through surgical implants, different kinds of skeletal anomalies that are recorded with x-rays or radiographs, but primarily, as my forensic odontology colleagues at NFSU understand, that we primarily make a personal identification of an individual through dental processes or dental radiographs or dental examinations. And so we compare the pre-death or ante-mortem with the post-death or post-mortem radiographs to make that determination. And so why am I spending so much time talking about what forensic anthropology is? Well, forensic archaeology, basically, if it's done properly, can provide the context and the evidence and transport it from the field setting to the laboratory. And so forensic archaeology basically gives us the foundation of the evidence that's going to be delivered to the laboratory for analysis. So the detailed recovery, the detailed notes, the detailed documentation and photography are extremely important. And so in trying to define what forensic archaeology is, I want to say that it's to understand the formation of assemblages or groups of material of biological, bones, and or material evidence, the artifacts or just normal evidence that's created by criminal activity or some kind of disaster within a broader scope of the landscape. And that landscape can include both internal, inside buildings, homes, different kinds of areas, but primarily sometimes we're just talking about external or outside, so materials. We want to do the archaeological assessment of doing the recovery and record the materials in a manner that preserves the integrity of the spatial and temporal context of the scene. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that we want to know which materials were associated with other materials. And so those of you that have done crime scene investigation or are taking the classes or read a lot about this in your studies, primarily taking maps, drawings, and photographs of a crime scene. And so these are really important. And what do I mean by temporal context is that we want to be able to say, what was the time span that happened that led up to the creation of this crime scene, and how has it changed since the crime occurred? So we want to say, how did it form? How did the materials get there? How was it disposed of in terms of maybe a burial? And then how has it been modified after that? And so a lot of the times, most of the modification for human remains are through sometimes the perpetrator will go back and try to move the body or change the crime scene. We know that's a very common thing, that perpetrators will go back to a crime scene, particularly if it's being investigated in a more public forum, and that oftentimes the perpetrator will be in a crowd that might gather. But we also know that other types of things like dogs or cats or and wild animals will come in and try to consume the body and disperse the remains around the landscape. And so that's another thing that we can look at, how things change before we get there to document what's going on. So there's many different kinds of sites. So primarily the kinds of sites that we're looking at are surface scatters of remains that were never buried. We can have burial sites of people that were deliberately buried or incorporated naturally into the environment, whether they fell and were killed, buried in clandestine hidden activities, mass graves, but also in natural occurrences where people can die, and then including mass disasters such as earthquakes and things like that. Other mass disasters that we might think of are airplane crashes, mass fatalities, and mass suicides, such as what happened in Jonestown, Guyana in the 1970s. So just as a quick overview of some of the things that we want to do in forensic archaeology is we may be the first people to arrive on a scene, and so we want to determine and protect the scene to prevent unauthorized disturbance by people or natural events. You want to keep the animals away, you want to keep bystanders away, and so this is why a lot of the times we will put up the crime scene yellow tape around our scene to keep people from coming into it only if they have special authorization. We want to record and recover the evidence. Usually we want to try to do this in a three-dimensional spatial framework. We want to be able to take the information that we record in the field and go back to the laboratory and reconstruct it. So if we were able to take all the dimensions and all the evidence, we could put it into a computer with any kind of the GIS programs and make a 3D model of what we found at the site. And there's a lot of technology now that allows you to do that with portable LiDAR units and things like that. I'm just working with the Omaha Police Department here in Nebraska and just doing an exercise, but they had some really sophisticated equipment, which was probably the equivalent of I don't know, 2 or 3 lakhs worth of rupees. That was cost of the equipment, but it created a beautiful 3-dimensional model that we could see almost immediately on a tablet, on an iPad. So we were able to recreate the crime scene with millions of points and overlay photography on the top of it. And it was a 3D representation where we could move in and move out of the material. We are also using drones for training and photography and documentation. So it was very interesting. But the other thing that we want to do besides that is we want to be able to preserve and curate the evidence so that we don't do any damage to it, so that it goes from the field to the laboratory in a best condition as possible. This is just an example. This is one of the exercises that we did with the Omaha Police Department. And so you can see this is a grave that we created. So it has actually, it has a plastic skeleton in it. So we were just doing a training operation. And so we had our 2 perpetrators came in, buried the body, and then we came in as the investigative team and trained the police to recover this and document it in terms of archaeology. And I don't have time to go through the entire process, but I just wanted to show this. So you can see, obviously, once you dig a hole to bury a body, it's there forever. So you saw some of the material that I was excavating at Harappa, and that's 4,500 years old. So once you dig a hole or make something and it gets buried, it's there almost forever. And so this is the key thing about archaeology is a lot of people think when they dig a burial or dig a hole, put a body in it and bury it, that it's hidden. But if we can find the location, usually through witness testimony, it's very easy for us to determine that there was a hole dug there and recover the remains. And so this is some of the drone pictures that the Omaha Police Department did. And so you can see the areas that we were walking in the prairie to excavate these 2 fake burials, but we focused in on one that's on the left. And then you can see that we used these grid squares to excavate so we could map and record everything in 3 dimensions. And so we know how deep all the remains were found, and we're able to map everything in context. So we know which stuff was found, where it was found. There were shell casings. Now the skeletons have clothing on them for next year. And so, but it'll be a really good exercise. And this is something that when the memorandum of understanding between our 2 universities is formalized, that we would like to be doing some training like this for the National Forensic Science University eventually. So in dealing with evidence curation, so what we want to do is provide the appropriate chain of custody documents, the reports, or any other related documentation, videos, photography, three-dimensional rendering with LiDAR, drone photography. All of this relates back to a series of nested forms of documentation. Then we want to be able to present the findings. We want to be able to present the findings if needed in a court of law. Usually forensic archaeologists don't make testimony, but we want to be prepared to do that if we're called for a tribunal or for any kind of a criminal case. So, or in an adversarial system like we have in the US and other areas of North and South America. So that we want to be able to do that. So we want to produce a professional product. And we also want to, as part of that, we want to conduct our activities in an ethical manner. And primarily, this is creating a scene of respect for the dead, the people that we're recovering, and then identifying and working on their material in a very ethical and moral fashion. And so this is something that I think a lot of us, when we get involved in this constantly, we develop a sort of a dark sense of humor. And but with my students, I try to have them keep that in check, because what we want to do is to restore the name of these individuals. And I consider having your name and your identity returned to you is a basic human right. And so I think that if you keep that in your mind of establishing the name or the identity of this individual, then we can act in a very respectful manner. I know that some of you are familiar with these kinds of concepts of evidence bagging and labeling and chain of custody. Some of the documents that I've used on the left is a separate paper chain of custody, which basically every time the material is moves from one point to another, or is checked in or out of the evidence locker or the evidence area of the police station or the laboratory, you have to sign for it, and then it gets signed back. And so there has to be a consistent chain that shows that. But some of the other products that you all may be more familiar with your crime scene investigations are these products that are plastic and paper bags. Paper is really good for evidence, particularly if it's coming out of the ground, because it tends to be moist or wet or damp, and so this allows it to breathe without modifying it. But the Defense POW MIA accounting agency, their tradition was to use plastic. But oftentimes these other commercial products have the chain of custody already printed on them, so the bag or the container is actually the chain of custody as well. So how do we achieve the goals? So if the goals are to record and create products that can be used in a court of law at the highest quality. And so what we want to do is survey and analyze the topographic landscape. What is the landscape, the interior or the exterior landscape of where these crime scenes are located? We want to confirm that the area is a contemporary crime scene, that it's within our purview of a medico-legal significance or setting, that it's not an archaeological or a non-crime scene. We want to determine the scene's dimensions and perimeters. Where does the site or the scene stop? How big is it? So, and then the other thing we want to do is recognize disturbed soils. I'm gonna move this over here. Oh, I can't. Okay. So the disturbed soil is really key, because then it allows us to understand something might have happened here, including a burial. So I've talked a little bit about this, and we saw the grid strings that were over the top of the grave with the Omaha Police Department. But we want to record our data in 2- and 3-dimensional space. And so when we're looking at something in 2-dimensional via map, but we also want to understand how deep is the material, or just those X, Y, and Z 3-dimensional space coordinates. We want to determine the scene's chronological history. So again, that's that temporal aspect. We talked about spatial just a few seconds ago, and now we're talking about the chronology. So what was the site like? What was the scene like before? What was it like? How did the material get there? And what has happened to it since then? And so that leads us into, we want to be able to interpret the scene's chronological history within the context of the overall landscape. What was going on outside the scene? How did that affect what was going on inside the scene in terms of animals, insects, that kind of things. And then we want to be able to create maps, section drawings, which are, I'll show you those in a moment in a case study that I'll be showing, and other imagery from data recorded at the scene. Like I said, the 3-dimensional data, maps, section or soil profiles, and all kinds of different kinds of notebooks and things like this that we can take. There's a lot of documentation, and one of the things I'm trying to do is to move some of the documentation I do into a tablet PDF fillable forms that we can use in the field instead of writing in notebooks. So this is an example of some of the maps that is part of that documentation that you can do. So the squares represent the excavated area. Each one of those, I think, is about 4 by 4 meters. And then continued excavation, and then the different dots show where material associated with the pilot's body, clothing, or other equipment, as well as the red dots represent material where possible human remains were found. And so you can see the extent of the documentation is pretty extensive, but the map, and then this is basically based on a photo overlay from Google Earth. This is a more simplified map with the same kinds of things, where the red indicates where we found human remains. Again, about 4 meter squares in size, and then ME means material evidence or artifacts. And again, another one in a jungle area, excuse me, a forested area in Europe. So the other thing that we want to do in forensic archaeology is we want to recognize any floral or plant, faunal, animal, or other topographical changes. How has the landscape changed since the crime occurred? Has there been a landslide over the top of it? Have the animals dispersed the remains? Is there a way to use the plant life on there to locate other aspects of the crime scene? And we want to recognize the criminal and non-criminal human interaction with the landscape, because sometimes people are going to find these remains, or there might have been somebody that died in the woods, and I've seen this happen several times where a dog will come back with a femur in their mouth or part of a skull, because the dogs are very sensitive to smell, and they would find the decomposing body in the woods and bring back. So that's an interaction of some aspect of things that are going on. So we want to recognize an excavation of these buried surfaces, and then we want to be able to locate, recover, and preserve the physical and contextual evidence, how things fit together from the landscape and the soil. So how do we recognize? We're going to go back to this grave this fake grave that we created here in Nebraska for training. How do we recognize clandestine activity when people are excavating graves, putting in bodies, and they begin to decompose? Well, there's very significant changes that happen over that grave. And so you can see that this diagram shows that you have the grave. First of all, you can see from the photograph that it was disturbed. We can recognize that there's been a churning of the soil from digging it up, putting something in, and then putting the soil back. But as the remains begin to decompose, there's methane and other kinds of VOC gases that come out. The terrain begins to be uneven, and then as the body decomposes, the ground begins to collapse because of the void of the material as when it becomes skeletonized. And then because of the organic component of the decomposition, it causes much more lush vegetation to show up. And so we can use, excuse me, we can use those clues to find disturbed ground, as well as other things that are going on in terms of the decomposition and the change in the landscape. And so those are some of the kinds of things that you can begin to look for on a landscape if you have this kind of clandestine activity. Again, when I've done underwater investigations and crime scenes, people think that when they throw something in the ocean or in a lake or a pond or some kind of a tank, that it's hidden, but it's not. We can recover it, we can find it. And the same thing when people think that when you bury something that it's gone and hidden, and it's not, because we have techniques and knowledge and understanding to be able to find those materials. So what are some of the things that we can think about, that skills that you need to be a forensic archaeologist? First of all, you should be trained in standard archaeological techniques or doing a forensic archaeology field school, which are becoming more and more common. And like I said, this is something that we would like to assist with developing as part of the curriculum for the National Forensic Science University. So you have to be able to recognize and recover human remains in conjunction with a forensic pathologist or anthropologist. So oftentimes you may not, you just need to have a basic understanding of human skeletal or human osteology. We want to be able to recognize and recover material evidence in conjunction with a crime scene technician. And then we want to understand and implement scene of crime scene management, not allowing everybody in there, as well as the chain of custody, and understanding sampling strategy. Well, what is a sampling strategy? A sampling strategy is basically, if you have a landscape and you do not know where something is, then you can create a grid system over it, and then you can select randomly a certain percentage of those to excavate, and then hopefully that you would hit what you're looking for. And so we can say we excavated 20% at random of this area and we didn't find anything, so then maybe we're going to do 50%. So it's a continuing understanding of where to find something. So you need to understand these kind of sampling strategies, and this would be part of a larger course that I would teach. The other thing is that you want to be able to produce high quality written reports and presentations for a variety of audiences. You have to develop a logistical mindset as a forensic archaeologist, so you can understand, how am I going to get all of my equipment from the laboratory to the site or the scene? And so sometimes this requires you to make decisions about the level of recovery that you want to do, because maybe I don't want to take my 100 kilos of equipment into the jungle and then work on it there, or I may just take things and just do things in an analog sense and record it on paper. So, and again, we want to operate to the highest standards. A big push in the United States now is to developing standards of recovery, as well as basic aspects of standards of forensic anthropological analysis, as well as operate with a code of ethics. And remember, ethics is a codified system of behavior for our organizations. And I know that the National Forensic Science University has a code of ethics. The University of Nebraska has a code of ethics for faculty, staff, and students. And so that there are different kinds of aspects. So the forensic archaeological team should have a codified code of ethics, so everybody knows how they are to behave in different parts of their jobs. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that we need to understand that when we excavate a site or a scene, it's destroyed. So all archaeology is a form of destruction. But we need to remember, and if you have that in your mind, that everything that you do, all your documentation, all your photographs, everything is part of that recording, because we can't go back to a site and say, oh, I wonder where everything was, but we'll have it in our notes and our photographs. And so because archaeology is inherently destructive, just like a crime scene investigation where we begin to remove things. The reconstruction becomes the evidence. So our notes, our photographs, our maps, our digital imagery, all that becomes part of the evidence. And those are the key lines of investigation. We want to understand the spatial relationships between the different types of evidence and understand how these items of evidence are within their environmental setting. So these relationships can only be observed with the evidence in place. And so one of the things that's frustrating for me is before I get to something, before the documentation or details in that relationship of the different types of evidence that may be lost. And so that may be a key point of a criminal prosecution. So oftentimes the excavation team that conducts the excavation may be the only people to ever see the relationships between the items of evidence. So it's critical that the excavation team create the records that they can of the highest standards of their available technology and available situation. Many of my notes that were done by hand are smeared with ink, or the ink is smeared because we were 1 degree north of the equator, and hot. And so when you're sweating a lot and you're writing on paper, and that can cause some consternation with writing your notes. And so that has to be taken into account as part of the high standards under the situation that you're in. And the quality of the excavation is measured by the amount of information that's collected in addition to the number of or amount of evidence. So it's not just how much evidence we can collect, but how much information about that evidence when it was in the ground or on the ground. So when do we want to use forensic archaeologists? I would say potentially forensic archaeologists are useful at all crime scenes, but they're most useful when the evidence is beginning to become incorporated into the natural or cultural environment, when it's been buried and decomposing and things like that. So I think that that's a point where you might do that. So, but I think that at least with the training or the mindset of forensic archaeology is useful at all crime scenes, but most useful when the evidence is becoming incorporated into that natural or cultural environment. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. So we're going to talk a little bit about an aircraft crash site in Washington State in the United States. This is a type of aircraft that was flown during World War II. It's called a P-38. It was a pursuit aircraft. That's what the P stands for. And it was a fighter aircraft. And so the Germans called it the Twin Fork Devil. It was a very maneuverable aircraft, had several, and was relatively lethal aircraft. And so it was very maneuverable against some of the other aircraft that the Messerschmitts and things like that were in Europe. But we're going to be talking about an aircraft that was flying from the Pacific to Alaska and down into Washington State, where it disappeared. So on 28 November 1942, a pilot departed Elmendorf Field in Alaska. This is after he had taken this aircraft from the Pacific Theater, from the Pacific Islands to Alaska, and then was flying it down to Payne Field in Idaho. So he had to fly across Western Canada. So he failed to arrive at Payne Field, and he was last contacted about 100 miles east of the city of Bellingham, Washington, which is in the northern part of Washington. I'll show you a map in a moment. In 1997, 2 hikers came across the aircraft wreckage in the Pasayten Wilderness as part of the United States National Forests. And then in 2002, the site was finally reported to the Department of Defense for investigation. And then in 2005, I led a forensic archaeological team to the site where we excavated it and recovered the body of the pilot. Now, when I've talked about this case before, a lot of people will ask, why was there a 5-year lag from the time it was discovered by these hikers to when it was reported to the Department of Defense? Well, the hikers were conducting illegal activities. What they were doing was that they were stocking lakes with fish, which changes the environment. And so they didn't report it for several years. So this is Washington State. You can see in the upper part of it, Bellingham, Washington, and then you can see the red star in the middle of the state up towards the Canadian border, and that's the location of the rough location of that site. And so again, here's the topography. You can see here this lake. This is where we camped, and it's not really a nice place because it was in August, but it was snowing because we were at about 8,000 feet. And this is the location on a very steep slope of where the crash site was. I guess it's not really, you get an idea about what the weather's going to be like when you see a mountain near there called freeze out. So it was kind of, we got snowed out in August, and so we had to wait for it to clear before we could be picked up and get out of there. So this is what the crash site looked like initially, and you can see we did a very limited excavation, but with extreme positive results. So we had 2 engines, several machine guns, propellers, part of the boom, the tail boom of the aircraft. So we had, and then one of the fuel tanks. And I'll show some photographs of this shortly. We were able to positively identify the aircraft because the serial number and the construction number of the plane is always painted on the tail section. And so we were able to positively identify this aircraft associated with a single person in the aircraft at the time of the incident. So this matched that loss of the pilot flying from Alaska to Idaho. This is one of the machine guns. You can see because the barrel has been bent back quite a bit that there was quite a force of the impact, but you can also see the feed tray has been opened because the hikers that came across this also took all the ammunition. So there was some aspect of that. We found a lot of ammunition on the ground, but what was ever in this feed tray they had taken. And so we had civilians running around with high explosive rounds that they were keeping in their garage in Seattle. This is primarily what it looked like. If you look closely at this photograph, you can see green ropes over the landscape. Because this was so steep, we had to have safety ropes for, and then basically climbing gear to maintain our stability and safety at the site. This is one of the propellers that was torn off the engine. And this is the main section of the aircraft. In the middle of that, up towards the front, that's the tail with the number painted on the opposite side from the photo. And this is part of the wing bent back over the, you can see the landing gear. And this is the tail boom. And this tail boom was really interesting because it had a luggage compartment or baggage compartment in it where we found lots of personal effects of the pilot. And this is the lower portion of the cockpit area that had been burned. And so it was, this aluminum was melted, heavily burned. It's doing what I call decomposed aluminum, which once it's been burned, it begins to form a sort of a waxy translucent surface to it. And then it breaks down into smaller crumbled particles. You can see that we established a grid system over the site to begin excavation. You can see that green rope, safety rope running down the middle of the site. And this gives you an idea about how steep it was, so that we had to find whatever flat areas we could, because we took all of the soil and it was screened through a 6mm mesh to recover any small items like teeth or buttons or other kinds of evidence that we might miss during the excavation. But you can see that we had a pulley system where the buckets would go down to this screening station, and these 2 soldiers would screen the material and recover any of the smaller evidence. And this is what it looked like afterwards. You can see the discoloration from the soil. Some of that's natural discoloration, but the reddish represents burning from the crash. Again, looking upslope, where we've completed the excavation, where we've gone through everything that's on the surface and slightly below the surface and recovered what evidence was there. And again, going back to the crash site. And so I want to point out, if you see at the top of the diagram, so we had a grid system laid over the site. We excavated these areas. We recovered lots of material evidence and bones. But the bones, the human remains, were primarily associated with what we called feature 1. So what is feature 1? It's a burial feature. So, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but I want you to remember, this is a burial feature. So how did the pilot get buried? This is the portion of the aircraft that we recovered. We found remains of everything but the material that's on the left that's hatched. We found representation of the 2 engines, the pilot, cockpit gondola, the wing, and then that one tail boom on the right. So all of this was, we found remains of this portion of the aircraft. This portion probably broke off during the crash because it went through the trees, and it was probably well below the cliff that we were working on. Okay, so this is a cross section or a section drawing that I talked about. This is what we did with the excavation. And so you can see upslope, where we have an excavation very shallow that we excavated, and then downslope, down below the main part of the debris, is that feature. So this is looking section through the earth against it, but you can see that we've got several different layers of stratigraphy or different strata that we begin to have. And this is what it looked like. And so we've got debris, we've got rocks, we've got remains, but the remains were primarily found in layer 3. And layer 3, and so immediately when we were discussing this in the field, my military colleagues thought that this was somebody had found the body and buried it. But there were certain characteristics of the body or the remains when we began to look at it. It had a lot of carnivore gnaw marks on the edges of it, as well as rodent gnaw marks on it. But we began to look at some of the, or I began to look at some of the literature, and what we found is that bears that live in this, balu, that live in this area, they would retrieve materials to eat in the winter and bury it as a food cache. And then they would come back to it in the spring. But for some reason, this bear never came back. So this is a deliberate burial, but it was a natural practice of a carnivore. So to preserve the body of this pilot for food. And so this is where we found the bulk of the remains were in this pit. So, but it wasn't done by a human. It is a burial, but not by a human. These are some of the items that we recovered. The material on the lower right is burned silk from the parachute. And the material on the left, the upper left, is the key significant one is this piece here. This is like the seat belt or the lap belt, and it's still latched and locked in place. And so it's one of the pieces of evidence that we have that the pilot was in the aircraft at the time of impact. We did find his identification tags and his rank insignia here, so because he was a lieutenant. This pilot liked to put his name on everything because I think that we always want to put name on our personal effects or our personal items. And so these are the remains of his aviator or sunglasses. And he had scratched his name in the case, the aluminum case, so it's K.W. Ambrose. Another thing that we found was a pen. And he had scratched his initials in the pen clip, so it says K.A. And the other thing that we found associated with his personal belongings in that baggage compartment in the aircraft was the remains of a radio, a ham radio or a personal radio that he was using. And this is what it looked like. So that's what we found, and this is what it looked like. And K.W. Ambrose, this is a photograph of the pilot and sitting in that aircraft. So we were able to recover the remains, return them to the laboratory, and identify this individual through a combination of the archaeology and the analysis of the artifacts and the analysis of the human remains with DNA. So in summary, I just want to say that forensic archaeology is a subset of forensic anthropology, but it's the aspect, or what we would call the tactical or the field aspect, that attempts to recover the evidence from the natural or cultural environment, I would say, if it's inside a building. Forensic archaeology attempts to understand how evidence has become incorporated into the natural environment. And then forensic archaeologists also need lots of different skills. And because of this, we tend to be excellent coordinators. And so I know that there are a lot of excellent coordinators out there listening right now. Again, to emphasize that all archaeology is destructive. And archaeologists need to focus on the spatial, or we focus on the spatial relationships between the items of evidence and how these are evidence are situated on or in the landscape. And then forensic archaeology requires meticulous recording in a variety of media. So digital, analog, photography, all kinds of different forms of recording. And the more that you can record, the better. But at the same time, we do always understand that we might be under a time constraint to get into a scene, record, recover the evidence, and get out of the situation, because there might be areas where you have certain in areas that I've worked in the world, we might have certain rebel factions that are controlling the area and only allowing us to be in the area for about 8 hours, and then we can't stay any longer. So we have to expedite the recovery. So what's the role of forensic archaeology? So it's the detailed investigation and collection of evidence. So forensic anthropology, the understanding of the recovery scene and its contents, is crucial for the analysts and the analytical strategy of the evidence. Thus, the detailed forensic archaeological approach will always provide the best context for the analysis. And like crime scene investigation and documentation, this provides the foundation for evidence recovery and analysis. And this is the foundation for all good forensic work. And I believe, no, that's it. So are there any questions? I will stop sharing. Okay. Are there any questions that anybody has? I think that there's might be some in the chat, or I'm not sure exactly how it'll work.
Yes, sir. So basically, if there are any questions from anyone, they can ask in the chat box, and sir will be answering accordingly.
If somebody has a question, they can put it in the question box or the chat box so that sir can answer.
Well, let me see if I can ask a question of the group then, and maybe they could answer. I know that some of the people in the audience are investigators. I know that a lot of you are students at the university, but maybe through some of your coursework in crime scene investigation, could you see where this concept of forensic archaeology could benefit, at least in a mindset or an understanding, not really maybe the technical skills, but understanding the concept of complete documentation. And so if there's no questions, I just want you to think about that when you're going through your coursework, how this from archaeological perspective could work.
Yes. Rehan, I think we have one question by Dr. Abraham in the YouTube. If you can see, then you can ask the question from sir.
I cannot see the YouTube portion.
Yeah, not a problem, sir. There is Dr. Abraham Johnson. He is our colleague in National Forensic Science University. So he has asked about, can you relate and share some insight on forensic taphonomy and archaeology?
Okay. Yeah, the question is, I'm going to type this in the chat box so everybody can see that. Okay, I want to thank Dr. Abraham for the question, but the relationship, forensic taphonomy is an integral part of forensic archaeology. And we sort of talked about that, how things change once they get into the ground or once they are incorporated onto the landscape, and what their condition is like when we excavate the material or recover it. And that is the complete understanding of that aspect of taphonomy. Taphonomy is an understanding of what happens to material, how is it modified through the natural and cultural environments in which it is in, from the time of deposition to the time that we recover it. And so there's a vast gamut of understanding, and there's several books, and this is something that we're actually going to be doing here at the University of Nebraska. The University of Nebraska, where we're going to be setting up a forensic taphonomy station, where we're going to be looking at decomposition and how that is significant in a specific environment that we have. And so it's the incorporation of forensic taphonomy and archaeology. Archaeology, I would say, is more of a technical thing, but forensic taphonomy needs to be one of the tools that we need to understand what has happened to the remains. So when I talked about the bear, and it had gnawed part of the body, and then later on, when the bones were completely, or when it was completely skeletonized, there were these little rodents called picas that came in and chewed on the dried bone. And so that's all part of the story, and that is part of forensic taphonomy. So it's an integral part of what we do as forensic archaeologists.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions from anybody? Sir, I have one question. I just wanted to ask that whether the facial reconstructions or the 3D superimposition of skull and the photographs also are being covered in this particular field of archaeology?
No, that would be something I think that we would do in the laboratory. So oftentimes, when I was with the Department of Defense, we had done a lot of this dealing with video or photographic superimposition, because we have a wide record of different photographs, because when you join the military, you always have several photographs taken. And I know that for India, there's the national identity card and things like that. And I think all of those are important sources for that. But it's not something that we did on a regular basis, because oftentimes the skulls were extremely fragmented. And then when we tried to reconstruct them, there's always some distortion with that. But it's all part of the same, you know, it's a huge part of the same kind of process where we go from the field to the laboratory, and that recovery, it might not be something specific that we would do associated with the archaeology aspect, but it's all part of that continuum going to the identification. So I think that doing facial reconstruction and 3D reconstruction of the bones, and this is something I've been working on with Dr. Gargi and Dr. Abraham in dealing with 3D reconstruction. And so it's something that's very interesting, and it can lend itself to an identification, but it's not something specifically that we might do in the field.
Okay.
Very
thank you very much, sir. Thank you for the answer. There is another question from Ms. Kritika Rajesh. She's asking that which regression equation is best for stature estimation in Indian population?
Well, that would require me to do a little more research on that, but there's my Indian colleagues all over India, and I would not say, I would say it depends on what region of India you're in too, because Punjabis are going to require a different regression equation than Gujaratis or Marathi speakers, or it's just going to be variable all over this vast subcontinent and the continent of India. So, but I would say that there are several regression equations based on different bones for stature that are in the Journal of Forensic Science, and so I'm going to write this down, and then I'm going to send this to you, Dr. Soderby, and then we can, and then you can distribute that as needed. So, but I will do some research and find some articles. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Sure, I'll circulate to the concerned person. There is the continuation. Again, the Kritika Rajesh, she is working with FSL or Forensic Laboratory. She has asked that recently they have received a case from the IO where they have given them the skeletal remains, and they asked them to conduct a chemical analysis of that particular skeletal remains. So from these skeletal remains, what are the type of chemical analysis we can infer?
Well, I guess what I'd want to know first is what kind of what's the end goal for a chemical analysis? Do they want to understand the nutrition? But I think, well, actually, one of the things that you could do to look for that we've started doing here in the US a lot as part of forensic identification is isotopes. And right now we're looking at, with the Department of Defense, we're looking at, you can look at strontium is a good one for what you're looking for is where did these people come from? But that requires us, so the isotopic analysis, and depends on, is it oxygen, is it nitrogen, is it strontium? Those are the ones that you primarily look at, and that you may want to, but you have to have a database of groundwater from around the country. And so that will allow you to compare what's in their bones or teeth to where they may have grown up or where they may have come from. And so that would, to me, that would be something that you could do that would give immediate results, but you'd have to be able to look at, have a database about groundwater from around the country. So that's something that we're starting, and those are called ioscapes or isoscapes. So the isotopes landscapes across countries. And so we're just starting to do this in the US. But, and I believe there's probably some data for that in India, because this is becoming a very common form. And I think that the isotopic analysis will give you some idea about where these remains came from or where that person grew up.
Thank you, sir. Another question from Ms. Shovanlal Mehti. He is asking about when the death occurs by any toxic chemicals. Forensic anthropology, can it give some information about this?
Yes, if there's you can get idea about that from the decomposition products that will be in the soil. So you would want to collect some of the soil and analyze that for some of those kinds of things. But there are certain poisons or toxic chemicals that will get incorporated into the bones. So that's another aspect that you need to, if you're going to, but that's usually over a long-term period of exposure. But your best bet to find stuff might be in the soil, but it also might degrade through the decomposition or the degradation of these chemicals. But the soil would be a good source of that around the body, as well as maybe sampling the bones to see if any of that material was long-term toxic exposure.
Okay, thank you, sir. There is another question from Mr. N.S. Dev. He's asking that how you differentiate between human interference in the crime scene with respect to natural or animal interference.
Okay, well, thank you for that question. And this is part of forensic taphonomy that we talked about a little bit before. So animals leave very specific kinds of signatures on the bones, usually through either dispersal of the remains or through the gnawing of the bone. So certain kinds of carnivores will gnaw on the epiphyses or the ends of the bones to get at the fat. Other carnivores or scavengers will have large, massive jaws where they'll crack the diaphysis or the shaft of the bones to get at the marrow on the inside. And then other scavengers, such as rodents, will come in and gnaw on the dry bone once it's been totally skeletonized and dried. And so there's a sequence that we can look at and signatures that are on the bones themselves, but they also leave signatures within the grave or the dispersal pattern. So this individual for that aircraft crash site, when we laid him out on the skeleton, he looked almost exactly like what we saw, what we see with a bear attack. So a body that's attacked, a person that's killed and attacked by a bear and then consumed. And so what was left and the gnaw marks on the bones, if we disregarded the rodents, it looked exactly like what we saw with a modern bear kill. But the other thing is dealing with, and this is something that we've started to research, what are the kinds of things that are humans or Homo sapiens as a taphonomic process. So people will come in and try to move the material, move the graves, burn the graves, burn the evidence. And so we see this in Europe after many of the horrific genocide. The perpetrators, especially if it was state-sponsored genocide, would go in and excavate these mass graves or re-excavate them and try to burn or destroy the evidence or disperse it around the ground. And so there's, those are completely different kinds of signatures. And I can also send you, I think Mr. N.S. Dev is on my LinkedIn, and so I can send him an article on humans as a taphonomic process. So that's actually quite good. And it's talking about some of the things that happened in this Spanish Civil War, as well as some of the ways that people try to hide crime. And so this is a really interesting component of taphonomy, is what do humans do after they've committed something to hide the crime.
Okay, thank you, sir. I think we are over with the questions. So thank you so much, Dr. William Belcher, for sparing your valuable time and sharing your knowledge on the very informative and very new field of forensic with us. Thank you so much, sir. I hope the session went well for the participants too, and we will again look forward for many such informative sessions from you along with NFSC. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you to my organizing committee members for wonderfully conducting the session, and thank you to the dear participants for participating and showing your interest in the particular subject. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
It was a pleasure and quite an honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.